Good morning, afternoon, and evening, besties. Happy Monday. Happy Monday and happy February and Black History Month to all of you. Very exciting times. I have a lot to say today. Hi Tom, hi Deb, hi Rari, hey besties. So good to see you guys. Hey Nicolita. I'm so glad y'all are here. Thank you for being on time, even though I was not. Um, but I like to start with some people in the room, so this works out. So last week, I I started on. First of all, it feels like it's been at least 2 weeks since I've spoken to y'all. The way that politics is set up right now and life, time is moving by very slow and fast at the same time. So I feel like so much has happened since we last spoke, but one of the things that we talked about last week was all of this Pisces stuff upcoming. We talked a little bit about Venus retrograde, and we'll talk more about Mercury retrograde in Pisces. We have eclipses in Pisces, and then Saturn will enter Pisces, and all the Pisces at the same time. And of course, the planet responsible for Pisces is Jupiter, which is the star of our show today. Jupiter in Taurus, specifically, who stations direct tomorrow. So that will mark the end of Jupiter retrograde and kind of, I guess, make some things click into place about what's been happening during this entire Jupiter transit. So I have done a lot of research, a lot of history research over the last week, and something I've kind of decided loosely is that one of the roles I would like to play in the revolution, if you will, or whatever we want to call this time period right now, is political education, specifically maybe historical education, because I'm finding it's a lot more interesting as an adult and it's a lot more interesting as an astrologer to study history. So I want to dedicate this channel to as much as that so it can so that we can accurately navigate the times, right? So that's something I'm going to try to do moving forward. Hopefully my life circumstances don't change so much that we can't do that, but if nothing else, you have this resource. And what I like about it, and something me and my former mentor used to say a lot, is that you can talk about politics under the guise of astrology and hopefully fly under the radar of the state. So that's why whenever I title these things, I just title them as whatever transit, so that people, so if you know the, so then if, so that if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't. So there's that. And some of the things that I started researching, one was what we'll talk about today, which is like what actually is fascism and the history of fascism, specifically through fascist Italy under Mussolini and then a little bit under Hitler, obviously. Some of the other things that I want to discuss, maybe not today, but just in general along this theme, is like the civil rights movement. Like, what is liberalism in the US? The history of like communism. I've already done a World War II deep dive that I will need to do again. I want to do a World War I deep dive. I want to do a pre-America colonization deep dive, which I've also already started. And we need to have a lot more smoke towards Spain. I can tell you that much. So those are kind of the things I looked into over the last week, and definitely need to structure those a little bit more, those conversations a little bit more as it relates to astrology, because I'm already noticing some patterns. And surprising to nobody, that pattern does seem to directly have to do with Virgo and Pisces transits. I don't fully understand the Virgo side of it just yet, but I'm kind of starting to see it take shape. Um, and just to kind of tell you what I'm noticing, like right now, I have a chart pulled up. It's just like a random date in 1922, which was post World War One, but pre World War II, I believe, more or less. And there's a Saturn and Jupiter in Virgo conjunction. Just happens to be on this chart. I wasn't expecting that whenever I pulled this. I pulled a 1922 chart to talk about fascism in Italy. So there's another time period, 1981, I believe, that is the Reagan administration, like his inauguration. Started with, there's a Capricorn stellium, but it was as both Jupiter and Saturn were stationing retrograde together in Virgo. What is it about Virgo? So I'll need to look into the last time Jupiter and or Virgo, Jupiter and or Saturn were in Virgo, which I believe was 2015-ish, 2014, 2015-ish. So I'll need to look into that and see what the connection between all of that is. But very interesting to see those connections. Another thing I wanted to follow up on from our conversation from last week was the all of the Pisces connections that we were trying to make, and how I said that that was likely related to the now moment. If y'all noticed on socials, I talked about how Project 2025 seems to be one directly tied to this whole Saturn Jupiter in Virgo thing, but also tied to Pisces transit, specifically Jupiter in Pisces in 2022. I wanted to talk about that. I'll probably talk about that another time, like on a different live. But basically, Project 2025 is the ninth iteration of a set of, I don't know, books basically called the Mandates for Leadership. And all of those are written by the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is basically a conservative think tank group that has been operating since just before the Reagan administration. And then the Reagan administration was the first time that they implemented this kind of mandates for leadership thing. So there's already a connection there. The Project 2025 version of the mandates for leadership was drafted in April 2022 when Jupiter entered Pisces. So we're seeing the Project 2025 basically start to take shape now. That's a little bit of the astrology behind it. I still have more to kind of research, but there's that. So anyway, all of that to say, let's talk about Jupiter and Taurus and kind of how we got here. So Jupiter first entered Taurus May 1st, 2024. So that was when this transit started last year, last May. The pre-shadow period would have been July 15th, where Jupiter was at 17 degrees Taurus. And then the first stationary retrograde, the first time Jupiter stationed retrograde, was October 18th at 27 degrees. This is in 2024. So October 18th, just before the election, Jupiter stationed retrograde. Have lots of videos on that if you haven't seen them already. Just check my catalog. And then Jupiter will station direct tomorrow at 17 degrees, where it's basically been for the last month and a half or so. And then this whole retrograde phase, pre-shadow, post-shadow, will finally end on April 29th, 2024, this year. So if any of those dates tie together for you or bring some things up for you, there's a reason. So what is Jupiter in Taurus? Like, what has this transit really been about? Well, when we were first talking about it last May, like before it entered, we have a astrology of 2024 podcast where we kind of speculated on what the astrology of the year was going to be like. One of the things that we discussed was like the culture shifting, basically, and this idea of like conforming, what it means to conform and to assimilate, and like what are the identities that have the power to say like who and what is normal, or who and what is acceptable or approved of by the state. At the time, we hoped that Saturn in Aquarius would influence Jupiter and Taurus to kind of shift the culture in the direction of being more open and accepting and equal for all intents and purposes. Just a summary of more equality, hopefully, more people being allowed to self-determine their identities and be able to see themselves outside of the eyes of the state, basically. But as we can see, what actually happened was a really hard shift into basically Christian nationalism, for lack of a better way to put it, or nationalism in general, if you want to take it that far, which is relevant to today's conversation. And we can see this through basically the strength that the right side of the political aisle has gained over the last several years, really, and especially post-election, like the way that everybody kind of shifted right, whether they realized it or not. We also realized a lot of this through Palestine, a lot of the Palestinian movements and people trying to advocate for their liberation and how many people also opposed it or, were caught up in their own indoctrination that they couldn't really see why our liberation is tied to theirs. But all of these things are connected. So in short, Jupiter and Taurus has been a lot about acceptable identities, I'll say, politically acceptable identities. And like the I was going to say the resilience of the status quo, but really like trying to maintain the status quo, especially politically and socially. So Jupiter retrograde then would imply that like we're seeing a cultural shift of some kind. The whole retrograde thing is like a recontextualization of, okay, what does culture look like? What does a normative culture look like in 2024 and 2025? That's kind of the question I feel like that retrograde was answering. So all of the events that have happened over the retrograde have done that, have kind of put the pieces into place that say, okay, this is why we're looking at each other and our own identities within this context the way that we are, is because our political system, our economic system, our health care systems, all of these things are in shambles, more or less. So we're having to orient ourselves towards each other and towards society and towards politics in a different way. Cool. So with Jupiter and Taurus and Pisces transit specifically, what I was trying to sort out last week was like, how do things like respectability and approval and conforming and assimilating and all of that type of stuff, how do those things relate to these Pisces themes that have to do with like truth and meaning and understanding and gaslighting and I don't know, whatever else you could, intuition, truth and meaning making, stuff like that. How do those two things combine? It didn't make sense at the time, but upon my deep dive into fascism, it became extremely clear. So to kind of lead into this, I want to talk about some of the things happening now. The first one, James Stewart, the conjure cleaner. If y'all know James, he was releasing some of his drafts on TikTok, and he released this one that just said it didn't occur to him how many people were more concerned with civility and not disrupting environments. Like they were more concerned with basically maintaining the vibe, like good vibes, than they were with their own self-preservation. And so I heard that and I was like, ding, ding, that's straight up like Taurus and Scorpio. Taurus being the kind of maintaining civility side, not wanting to rock the boat. And then Scorpio being something that's just inherently disruptive in its nature because its differences are visible and can't be ignored. And I thought that this idea of like docility is a Taurus theme. Docility is kind of our way right now of denying the reality that's in front of our eyes. So why do I say that? Jupiter as a planet is about self-trust. Basically, that's like the gift that Jupiter gives us, being able to trust ourselves and to trust and to kind of use story and meaning making as a way to facilitate that self-trust. But when you have Taurus and Pisces at the same time, sometimes basically you're more willing to doubt yourself in order to be accepted, or you're more willing to doubt yourself in order to assimilate, or to at the very least like fly under the radar and not bring more harm onto yourself. So technically is a form of self-preservation, but it's a form of self-preservation that gives the people who are doing harm, it's enabling harm basically sometimes depending on the context. So not speaking directly about Taurus and Pisces people when I say this, I'm speaking about a dynamic between these two signs and the ways that they kind of work together to accomplish a goal. So on the one hand, self-approval on the Taurus side, Jupiter and Taurus, would lead to self-trust. One would lead to a strengthened intuition that says, I believe myself, I trust what I'm seeing, I trust what I'm experiencing, and I don't need somebody else to tell me if I'm right or wrong. I trust myself, I believe myself, I approve of myself and, the identities that I have, right? And then the other side of it is, well, I don't have very much power to influence change. I have to subordinate myself to some kind of authority, and I have to believe what they say instead of believing myself. That's the other side of the spectrum. So with Venus specifically going through this retrograde, something that I think is happening is this like lulling of the population kind of into this like hypnosis, and I'll explain later why I'm using that word, but this kind of hypnosis or this kind of trance, if you will, that's mostly through emotional manipulation and all of this like shock and terror that's happening in this first 90 days, which is most of this Venus retrograde. um, the more that we can be kind of subdued into being disoriented about what is real and what isn't, the easier will be to control later. Or, the more susceptible we'll be to propaganda, the more, hey Jem, the more open to influence we are, just the weaker we are. And so that's why I've been saying it's really important to take a lot of what's happening right now in some ways at face value, like it is what it looks like, but then the stories and the narratives that we're being told about what we're experiencing, take those with a grain of salt, because everybody has an opinion and they're not all necessarily in alignment. Um some other advice that someone gave that I thought was relevant to Mars retrograde in Gemini right now, but also later Jupiter in Gemini, is that our biggest impact to like combat all of the gaslighting and all of the disorientation that's happening is through sustained focus rather than scattered awareness. So picking one issue that's relevant to you and really like focusing in on that, and then sharing what you're observing with people who maybe have a different focus area, so that you're not having to do the Gemini thing of having your hand in too many pots at once and then overwhelming yourself with information, because that's what they want, is for us to be overwhelmed with information and to not know which way is up. Another thing someone suggested was to assume that initial reporting often misses context, which is very Gemini, information without context, especially when considering Jupiter in Gemini. So Mercury is very much, this thing happened. There's no context, there's no lead up, there's no explanation. It's just this thing happened. And then people take whatever headlines, whatever clickbaity articles or rage baiting topics, and then they run off with it, create all kinds of narratives that maybe are not even relevant to the original situation. So it's another thing. And then the last thing I wrote was our focus is the resistance. I don't remember what I wrote that about, but I guess the sustained focus needs to be around how do we resist what's going on. So that's kind of advice from Sagittarius, I would say, in the midst of all of this mutable stuff. Sagittarius says, hey, sustained focus on this one thing that you really believe in, that you feel really strongly about, and then let somebody else kind of carry the burden of a different specific topic, and then collaborate, within your groups. So a little strategy there. And then the last thing before I get into the history of fascism, there is an NYT, a New York Times TikTok opinion that they just released called How Does Tyranny Begin? And they interviewed like a handful of people who have experienced some version of fascism or authoritarianism in other countries or in other governments, and asked them like what their experience was, kind of how things were set up and how the dominoes fell that eventually led to a lot of them having to flee the country. And a lot of them basically had this overarching idea that falls directly in line with the gaslighting thing we've been talking about, that says at first, like, things will happen as far as censorship of different media outlets, right? Or censorship on social media or whatever it is, books, education, stuff like that. And hearing a bunch of narratives being kind of spewed at you from the government. And they said at first you'll want to think that it's not happening, because then you might have to do something about what's happening. I've said this before about Pisces. I've also said this before about certain cardinal placements. But in general, for humans, like, one of the reasons I think that we, for lack of a better way to put it, distrust or betray ourselves or self-abandon, is because if we were to fully I'm trying to choose my words carefully because I don't mean this to sound like a victim blaming thing, but it's just like part of the reason we go into denial about something is probably because we feel powerless, or because we know that in order to change things, or in order to take control over a situation, or in order to address whatever the thing is that we're in denial about, something about us would have to change, or something about our circumstances would have to change. And humans in general don't like change. Like, change is very costly to embody because it requires basically like taking on a new understanding of yourself and the world around you, right? Which we're talking about Pisces, we're talking about Jupiter, we're talking about our lens and perspective and understanding of the world. In order to change, you have to be able to release old narratives and old understandings of something. And so when you're being faced with the reality that something is not what you thought it was or what you believed it to be, then you have to do something about it. And that can create inertia in a lot of people, or just like a freeze response because it is threatening. So, in general, a lot of times we'll avoid feeling our true feelings about something, because if we were to really feel the truth of our discomfort or our dissatisfaction or displeasure, whatever it is, then we would have to change the way that we move and the way that we act. And that's not an easy thing to do. So, that was the first thing that they said. You'll want to think that it's not happening because then you might have to do something about it, which I think is where a lot of us are at right now. Are we really experiencing what we're experiencing? That self-doubt that Jupiter and Pisces stuff bring up. Also, I said hello to Jim, hello to Jada, hello to HP, and hello to Oniumi. I think I said your name right. I apologize if I butchered that, but you just walked into a read. So, basically the summary of it all was to hold on to truth. Like, they said that. I don't remember if it was in the New York Times opinion or if it was in someone commentating on the New York Times opinion, but in general, the word of wisdom was to hold on to the truth. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they would say that. And we're in the year our Lord 2025 that is full of mutable transits. So yeah, so that's kind of setting the stage. I hope that makes sense for really what is this Jupiter moment about. So to further get into like what is fascism, what are the parallels between like what we're experiencing versus what fascist Italy was experiencing or fascist Germany was experiencing. So I'm going to do my best to summarize the notes that I took over this video, which you can find on YouTube if you'd like to watch it yourself and form your own opinions. It is called, I believe it's called just What is Fascism by Ryan, what is his name? Ryan Chapman. And he does a really good job of explaining it in a way that's easy to understand, but is also like scarily similar to what we're experiencing now. He also has a lot of other videos that I've been watching to just kind of understand the misuse of language that we've been using. So yeah, all my friends are here. I'm well, thank you for reminding me, bestie daddies. Hey, Jada. Okay, cool. So let's start with Italian fascism, because as much as we think about Germany, whenever we think about fascism, like Mussolini was the OG fascist. And the reason why Italy is not often remembered for being fascist, like doesn't come to mind, is because it didn't really work out. Italians didn't really buy into it the way that Germans did. Germans really bought into that shit. So there's that. So to understand kind of how fascism came to be and why Mussolini got into it in Italy was through this author named Le Bon. He wrote a book called The Crowd, and Mussolini was interested in this. Mussolini kind of saw himself, he was an academic, he saw himself as a philosopher or whatever. So he's reading this book. And this is a direct quote from the book where Le Bon says, and keep in mind, this is like in the early 1900s. He says, while all of our ancient beliefs are disappearing and old pillars of society are giving way, the power of the crowd is the only force that nothing, what does my handwriting say? That nothing menaces, and of which the prestige is continuously increasing. The age we're about to enter will be the era of crowds. And this is basically where politics were becoming less elitist and more populist. And by less elitist, it just means that like people are being allowed to participate in politics, right? The trains did not run on time yet. The fantasy persists. That's funny. So the thing that LeBron was kind of doing was like this idea of the crowds. This idea of the crowd is what's relevant to, I think, the sign Taurus in general, but this like idea of like group psychology where the individual, and this is definitely a thing like studied in psychology and sociology, is like your sense of individuality for whatever reason tends to evaporate once you're involved in a group. What, no matter how big or small the group is, you kind of just assimilate into the group for one reason or another, I guess because of humans' innate desire to belong and to be in relationship. And so this idea of the crowd is like people get hypnotized whenever you tell them what they want to hear, what the group wants to hear, rather than telling them the truth and to appeal to their emotions. Like this is like verbatim from that video. This is not even me adapting it to our conversation. That's just straight up what they said. So I'm like, oh shit, well there it is right there. Like appealing to the emotions of the crowd rather than the truth of what they're experiencing will motivate the crowd way more than the truth will. Stories are better than facts, right? And so LeBon goes on to say something about like the masses have never thirsted after the truth. They turn away from evidence that is not to their taste, and they prefer to deify error if error seduces them. So seduction is a word we've also often used for Taurus transits as well. It's seductive, it's intriguing, it's something you want to lean into if it's like self-fulfilling, especially, which is very Jupiter. And then it goes on to say, whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. And then whoever's attempts to destroy them, or to destroy them, is always their victim. Or to destroy them, is that what I said? Basically, like whoever tells them what they want to hear, whether it's rooted in reality or not, becomes their master. And whoever is trying to tell them the truth and like kind of deter them from whatever the hypnosis is from the master becomes their enemy. So immediately I'm thinking, as far as present day goes, woke, quote woke as the right describes it, they've weaponized that term and bastardized that term from what it actually means and morphed it into whatever villain they want to whatever villain they need to morph it into to suit their agenda, as well as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like just the terms themselves, like not what they actually mean, but using these terms as like dog whistles, basically to convey meaning that these are our enemies. These are ideologies that are enemies to basically what we're trying to set up, which, spoiler alert, is nationalism, right? So Mussolini kind of takes LeBon's ideas here about the crowd and stuff and agrees with them. And he says that in the 19th century, individualism, which was liberalism, which we'll talk about later, liberalism was more like the dominating ideology of the time, which in short, liberalism in the classical sense means like basically freedom to do what you want to do as an individual and be involved in markets and shit like that. Capitalism, the freedom to do capitalism for white people. And classical liberalism. So he was saying the 19th century was mostly individualistic, but the 20th century would be more collective. Now, I know what you're thinking. That kind of sounds like communist, right? You're correct. Or at least sounds like Marxism. So he actually believed that Karl Marx was kind of onto something with his ideologies around like class, not necessarily class consciousness specifically, but just around this idea of like unifying groups and collectivism and things like that. But instead, he goes the route of George Sorel, who was another philosopher that kind of studied Marxism, but his own version of it. He believed that like Marxism was too narrow of a way to like view the world through class and like through just class and economics, and thought that sociology should be included. So things like culture and things like identity and stuff like that should be implemented in the Marxism, which is why Marxism, it can either lead to these kind of communist ideals or it can lead to fascism in a roundabout way. And take that with a grain of salt. It's contrary to what you would believe, but the idea is like groups, going back to this idea of like groups and groupthink and stuff like that. So hi Eska. So George Soros and Mussolini being inspired by George Soros kind of come up with this idea of like ideological unity to kind of lead people into this revolution away from liberalism at the time. This is post World War One, but pre World War II. And they believed that in order to create ideological unity, you needed mobilizing myths. And that part's important because myth is a Jupiter word. Mobilizing myths. And myths are basically stories in this context, stories that contain the strongest inclinations of people, and that people will cherish these myths above all criticism. So, some of the things I thought about modern day that are like some of these ideological myths are like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or getting it out the mud, from rags to riches, or in general, like justice prevails with all of the propaganda and stuff that we see in the media. This idea that at some point good is going to triumph over evil, and that if you work hard enough, eventually one day you'll make it. Those are like some cultural myths that we still abide by to this day, even though we have a lot of evidence that says those things are rare, actually. Thinking of Stop Cop City in the opposite direction. Right. So, so Mussolini and Hitler both thought that Marxism was correct to an extent about how to tap into the spirit of like mass populations by telling stories of like good triumphing over evil. But they thought that Marxism otherwise was like too divisive because it divides the rich and the poor. It brings up a lot of like classism and class war stuff, which is the whole point of Marxism, is to like, you know, seize the means of production and whatnot. But um that both Mussolini and Hitler thought that Marxist ideas needed to be reimagined, Aquarius keyword, with the living reality of the 20th century, and that they needed to overcome liberalism and democracy and this utopian spirit of the Bolshevism, which I think has to do with Soviet Union communism, but that's another deep dive I still need to get into. So instead of like class consciousness, Mussolini and Hitler thought that national consciousness should replace class consciousness, and that the greatness of the nation or passionate nationalism should be the new myth of the nation, basically. Or should be, well, class conscious. So getting rid of class consciousness and instead embracing nationalism was what they thought would be more successful. So they created then this myth of the nation as something that's not just like mythical ideology, but is now like a spiritual ideology, something that you really have to feel into, like deep into your bones and into your spirit. Your identity, right? Talking about fixed signs, Taurus and Aquarius, your identity is of the nation rather than of like whatever your individual or ancestral lineage is. It's blood and soil, basically. And they thought that, you know, really treating the myth of the nation as the spiritual thing that people could adopt would again appeal to their emotions, and then would also be more unifying than class consciousness, because you're really tapping into something like, I don't know, that everybody can get behind purely because they all live in the same nation, right? Which obviously we know it's not that simple, but this was the idea that they figured they would use to manipulate people into kind of coalescing around these certain ideas. And what I thought was interesting about this too was like something I said earlier, greatness of the nation, passionate nationalism. Oh, so this idea that like Marxism needed to be reimagined. I thought like hearing that language was interesting because obviously it pinged my Aquarius ears. And one thing that I noticed when looking through this time period was that Saturn moves through this kind of like World War One, post World War One into World War II era, is that Saturn moves through Leo, um, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and Scorpio is where it really kind of starts to take off for Hitler and them. And then Sagittarius really starts to take off for Hitler. And then you get to Capricorn, Aquarius. And then I think Aquarius, Saturn in Aquarius was like 1936-ish. And then Saturn in Pisces is whenever you finally get to like World War II and Nazism fully taking hold in Germany. So Saturn moves into Pisces this year, is why I make that connection. But this whole time we've been talking about self-determination for Aquarius and us, in our own biases, hoping that that means some level of increased freedom for, Black and queer people, women, and other marginalized groups, the same way that it was in the 60s. But I'm willing to think that if I investigate more into the 60s, I'll kind of understand why it didn't play out that way and why it's looking a little bit more like when Hitler redefined Marxism to fit his image, which was their version of Saturn and Aquarius. So interesting Astro T there. Let me see what y'all are saying in the chat. A myth I saw recently, I can manifest myself out of contracting illnesses. Oh my God, I saw that one too, right? And you can see how these myths, like when we were just talking about how being in denial can kind of serve a self-fulfilling purpose where you can insert your own story instead of accepting reality for what it is. That's exactly that. A uniting of awareness of the collective self, which led to the defining of the self and therefore defining the proper and improper identities of the nation. Exactly. And this right here, I feel like is what's actually been happening with these squares between Jupiter and Saturn and Aquarius, that we've been interpreting one way, but the reality was this has been what's happening. Defining of the self and therefore defining the proper and improper identities of the nation. This is what we're getting into next. So, you would be correct. Yes. And in fact, really you're grasping it. Cool. So for fascism, nationalism overrides all other political or moral concerns. So Mussolini basically quoted that our myth is the nation and the greatness of our nation, and to that greatness with which we want, and to this greatness which we want to translate into a total reality, we subordinate everything else. So basically, we'll do whatever it takes to make the nation great. What is that man's current slogan? Make America great again. It's right there, right? And even this idea that the needs of the nation, I think I wrote this on the next page. Yeah, fascists will do whatever it takes to bring about the greatness of a nation, literally whatever it takes. And that a nation, what would define when a nation is great? A nation is great when it translates into reality, the force of its spirit, which to me sounds like that kind of crossover between moving from Aquarius, which is more ideological, into Pisces, which is more of an embodiment of a certain truth and a certain spirit in this case. So that's kind of where we're at now. You can see this with obviously Make America Great Again. You can see this with the kind of inherent contradiction of Christianity and actual Christian values by the book versus what the right is actually doing in practice, and how what the right is actually doing in practice is more to the nation, or in this case to Trump directly, or to the to conservatives, or whatever group we're defining as the group in power. And that it doesn't really matter what you believe in. This, if you believe in the myth of the nation, in this case, if you believe in MAGA, then that's all that matters. You'll do anything that it takes to make America great again, whatever that means. There's a seesawing between toxic individuality and toxic group identification. Exactly. Yes, which is very Mars Venus, right? That opposition between Mars and Venus. You take it too far, toxic individuality; too far in the other direction, toxic group identification. Y'all are getting it. Y'all are such good students. Okay. So the next person of influence was an Italian philosopher with the last name Hegel. He wrote that, and check this out. He wrote that basically fascism desired harmony between the people and the state. And once you achieve this harmony, that's what makes a strong state. And then the state then determines the needs of the people. So the idea of this was to create a unitarian authoritative state with no opposition to it, and then to use the spirit of the people to make history and create a new civilization eventually. So for Italy, this was Third Rome, and for Germany, this was the Third Reich, right? And so part of the reason they couldn't really get fascism to work in Italy was because Italians didn't really buy into this deep sense of nationalism that Mussolini was trying to inspire in them. they were just kind of like, yeah, I don't know about all that. So I mean, they were definitely fascist, but like Deb said earlier, the trains were not, in fact, running on schedule. So the people were like, oh, I don't know about this. But in Germany, them people, obviously, they were really like, fuck yeah, Germany. um and really went for it. But this part right here is what I wanted to highlight, was like this desired harmony between people and the state. Desired harmony is making me think about, again, assimilation and conforming for the sign Taurus, and kind of how it works on the population level. Everybody's assimilating into a national or state identity rather than into their individual identities, as their individual self-determined identities. Instead, our identities are being determined for us by the state. And therefore, we've asked this question before, if y'all been following me for a while, like, what makes a person a person? And in 2021, I think, is when we first started asking this question, because Jupiter was in Aquarius. And that was something that my old mentor Dana came up with, People's Oracle. This question of like, what makes a person a person? And if you remember, if I'm remembering correctly myself, there was I don't know if it was a law or a bill or whatever it was, but there was a new classification for corporations, that basically corporations gained free speech in the same way that a person would. So in a roundabout way, corporations were kind of became people, for lack of a better way to put it. And so whenever you become a person in the States, then you now have rights under the Constitution. And this allows corporations to basically give money to politicians and to lobby and things like that legally, as a form of free speech. Something I listened to on a podcast called 5-4, which I'm also listening to learn more about Supreme Court stuff. So that happened. And that's relevant because somewhere down the line, I talk about how one of the things that, oh, well, actually, that's the next point. So one of the things that fascism does economically is creates an alliance between liberalism and socialism, which sounds contradictory, but basically the idea is to create a corporate state. And this is definitely something that I think Mussolini wanted, was a corporate state. We can see this happening now with thing one and thing two, bozos in Trump's cabinet, Muskrat and the other guy. And what did Meta Drake, I think is what she calls him. Muskrat and Meta Drake both combining forces basically with Donald Duck, and having this merging of corporation and the state. So a lot of that, yes, Citizens United, thank you, that was the case. Made money into speech and corporations into people, exactly. So that was, I believe, Citizens United versus somebody court case. And that was, I want to say, in 2021, 2022, when Jupiter was in Aquarius. So that kind of set the stage of the context for then a lot of the stuff that would happen with Saturn in Aquarius, namely this election where Elmo Muskrat basically bought the election, right? And money was allowed to interfere. And same thing, honestly, for the Skiwi lady too, as HP affectionately calls her. Because a lot of they raised billions of dollars overnight for her campaign as well. So all of this basically, like this idea of merging liberalism and socialism, but under fascism, was to, like I said, create an alliance between corporations and the state. And this is to combine capital and labor, which capital being the liberalism part and labor being the socialism part. But under Mussolini, that didn't work in Italy. People just didn't buy into it. But it has elements of both capitalism and socialism economically. It's just not from the dogmatic perspective of like trying to make these things into ideologies. They're meant to be very pragmatic, right? And just like functional and economic, which that part to me kind of speaks to whatever these Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions in Virgo during these times are probably alluding to. So I'll have more to say about that another time. But that's basically like how fascism started in Italy, and like the actual ideology of fascism being birthed under Mussolini, more or less. And even though it didn't work out practically for them, that was like fascism in ideology. Fascism in practice is whenever we get into Hitlerian fascism. So this all started for Germany post World War I, because they were suffering economically from hyperinflation due to constraints from the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles, and this whole thing basically is like what leads into World War II later, and I'll talk about that another day because I need to make notes on that video. Hitler believed, I believe it was Hitler, believed that people needed confidence that they could break out of these constraints and break out of this downtrodden economy through mass politics, or this idea of like the crowd or the group politics that we've been talking about, and eventually regain freedom. But so part of the unspoken context of all of this that I don't have all the information about yet is that like a lot of what's happening during this time is a reaction to communism in Soviet Union, Russia, I'm pretty sure. So it's like everybody is trying to maintain liberalism, which basically capitalism at the time, or democracy, or whatever you want to call it, out of fear that they'll become communist and basically like people regain control over the means of capital. But they didn't want that. So a lot of why Hitler had so much success was because all of the other countries basically appeased him and Mussolini for whatever they wanted, because they were like, well, as long as it's not communism, fine, do what you got to do, but leave us out of it. And I was like, are you for real? So that's how you know communism is that girl, whenever everybody is like, we would rather have fascism than let people have any sense of actual liberation. But I digress. Hey Samaje, I'm giving a history lesson. So yeah, for Hitler, then the idea was to make Germany great again. And I'm not joking. Literally to make Germany great again by their myth of the nation having to do with like purifying German blood, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard that. This is what would put people in touch with German nationalism and to actually like conform to it. Going back to our Taurus word again. And so same thing, individuals are to be subordinated to this greater idea of the people. So it's erasing individuality and then really like propping up this group think or this larger national identity. And then a person then in this case was defined as someone who is loyal to the nationalistic identity. So not loyal to, in today's terms, like part of the reason they need to get rid of DEI is because there is no DEI, there is no diversity, there is no equity or inclusion, because everybody is now what we've decided is an American. And if you aren't an American, you're going somewhere else, right? Same thing in Germany. If you're not pure-blooded German, as we've defined German through German nationalism, you will end up somewhere else that you don't want to be. And that would mean like anybody. So a direct quote from that was a community of psychically homogenous creatures. Again, going back to this Taurus theme of like a shared identity. Psychically homogenous creatures who are directed by the state, and that every thought, idea, doctrine, knowledge, etc., must serve the people, again, people being nationalism, and fatherland. And what does my handwriting say? And I don't know. This is also why they're anti-science and deleting all of the info on the federal websites, exactly, and censoring history and everything else, exactly. What did I say? Oh, back to the thing of like religious conflicts. Religion will always lose to nationalism. And so a memo that came directly from the Nazis was to basically like start exterminating anyone who isn't purely nationalistic through eugenics. So this is where we get the original like description of eugenics, which I will read just for the sake of understanding. It says in this memo from a high-ranking Nazi official, all Germans are unequal. That is the starting point. The first logical conclusion to be drawn from inequality is the inequality of value. Some Germans are more valuable than others. A logical consequence of inequality is unequal treatment. Unequal. What does this say? Oh my gosh, I write too fast. I should have typed it. Unequal treatment. So basically like unequal access to state power. Oh, unequal at that time included state power, property, and culture. So all of their so basically, like, all of the resources will be distributed to people on the basis of how valuable they are, and so no pity is to be shown to those who occupy lower categories of the inferior, oh my gosh, I do not know what I wrote, I'm so sorry. Basically, the idea, I'm not even gonna read it all, it's fine, but basically, the idea is that all, like, yes, German nationalism, right? Everybody is, if you live in Germany, you need to feel the depth of German blood and German soil in your being and spiritually become part of this nationalistic identity. And then they go on to say, except for there's a caveat, all Germans are not created equal. So just because you're a German doesn't necessarily mean that you also have equal access to property and power and whatever else. And so therefore, depending on, again, how closely you align with their pure version of whatever a German is or German nationalist is, the further you drift away from this purity, the less value you have in society, and therefore the less resources you'll receive, and also you might just be exterminated straight up. And they do say that in the last part, I believe. That the bottom category means destruction and death. And then they go on to say something about like trees that bear no fruit will be destroyed or some shit like that. So they just straight up were like, look, and they do list out all of the identities. I didn't do that for the sake of you guys know what those are. A lot of us know what they are. A lot of us occupy those identities, but they straight up were like, yeah, anybody who is not able-bodied, cishet, German, and they started with whoever else, right? Whoever, the Jews specifically were like their target. So all of this falls under the thinking with the blood of the nation thing that we were talking about before. And in general, thinking with the blood of the nation is basically how you would describe what fascism actually is. So it's, Nazi, the word Nazi comes from nationalist socialist or socialist nationalist, Nazi, nationalist socialist. And now the nationalism and the socialism that they're talking about is not maybe the way that you would traditionally understand those things. It's actually this idea, it's actually just a made up ideology of whatever the nation is, and being so loyal to the state that you'll allow harm to come to whatever groups. You'll allow harm to come onto whatever groups don't fit the identity of the nation. So depending on who's defining the identity of the nation, that determines who has rights and who doesn't, and who will either be deported or exterminated or thrown into labor and concentration camps. So now you have a brief history of fascism and what it actually means and how it comes to be. And now you can see some of the parallels between then and now. But now you also can see how they've weaponized certain words, like I said, like woke, like DEI, like, I don't know, even liberalism being something that's been bastardized from its original term to suit their agenda. Even socialism gets weaponized because it can go either direction that you want it to go. But hopefully my purpose in explaining all of this was to kind of show that, like, yeah, Jupiter station's direct tomorrow, and we can kind of see how over the last year, especially, that fascism has really dug its heels in through this ideology within Trump's campaign of Make America Great Again, and like the identity of like what an American actually is, American patriot, American nationalism, or even Christian nationalism if you want to bring Christianity into it. But based on fascism, Christianity comes second to the identity of being an American. Now, whenever we're talking about Trump specifically, I won't say that I don't know if we know that he's fascist. Obviously, he's fascist. But I think something I'm unclear about is, how much this is about Trump specifically wanting to be like a king and an authoritarian dictator, or how much of this is the, what's it called, foundation, the Heritage Foundation's mandates for leadership that just gives the president like basically unchallenged executive power, stuff like that. So I don't know. That's the part that I kind of want to look into more, is like how much and which parts of this is specific to Trump, and how much of this is um, Republican conservatives in the background who have been working towards this goal for the last several decades. And then in the larger picture, another thing that we'll discuss at another time is like what liberalism actually is. Cause I feel like we've thrown that word around so much over the last few years that there were even aspects of it that I didn't realize are not what we thought that they were. And that whenever you look at the actual original definition of liberalism, like the more classical or even some of the modern versions of liberalism, that's why people are like, yeah, the right and the left are the same. Because ultimately liberalism is about being able to participate in capitalism and thinking capitalism is a good thing, versus like thinking capitalism is a good thing and all people should have equal rights to participate in capitalism, versus like actually getting rid of it, which would lean more either socialist or communist. So I need to look into each of those things to get the full context, and then look into all of the other ways this is played out in society to get more of the understanding and context for why we believe the things that we believe. But I figured learning what fascism actually is and what it's been a response to would be a good contextualizer to lead us into the next season of events through this eclipse season, where a lot of those initial parts of really solidifying this myth of the nation, MAGA in this case, or authoritarian or loyalty to Trump, even if you just want to call it that, and this rise of like these rise of conservative values, and what all of this stuff is, this like kind of purging that's going on socially to create this more unified nationalistic identity. That's what Jupiter stationary direct is doing. So amazing that I just gave a lecture in an hour. So proud of myself. So yeah, if you just came in, please like the video. If you stayed the whole time, please like the video. I would love it if you're watching this at a later time for you to leave a comment in the replies to tell me if this made sense to you. What did you get from this information in our little history lesson? And if there's any other things that you want me to explore, I kind of have my list of things I need to stay focused on, but I'm also open to suggestions that may help lead me down different paths that need to answer other questions, because a lot of my research starts with me having a question about like, what am I actually looking for? What type of history am I actually looking for? What do I need to research? So the next thing that I'm trying to look into is, well, I have a few different things, but something that I'm really curious about is like England's role in shaping the US versus like, Spain or whoever else got here first, and not just England's role, but like what was happening in England that led to them colonizing the US. And I already have some of those answers, but I need to look deeper into it because I want the full context of what was going on over there. And then looking more into World War II, looking more into World War I and how that got started, and just refreshing myself on the history, not from the actual education system that we have relied on in the States. So I don't know, stuff like that. I would love to learn more about that too. Right now, I see it as less about Trump. He's just been the figurehead, I think, because he's good at it. I think this too, but I've also seen some people from other countries who have experienced a similar, I don't know, path of destruction, if you will, say that it may be more about him specifically because he's been plotting this since the 80s. And the 80s are a relevant time period for me astrologically. So that's another thing I'm trying to understand. Like, what does it actually mean? I understand now through understanding like how fascism actually works, the role of Pisces in all of this. I don't fully understand the role in Virgo in all of this. And so I'm going to look and see how Virgo stuff is played out in history through like the Reagan administration is one thing I'm going to look into. And then, I don't know, I might even look more into fascist Italy too, but it's going to take you into German history, not just the country, but the countries that became Germany because of empire. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I'm like, because I totally forgot, and I have to go soon, but I totally forgot that like Spain, obviously Christopher Columbus, but like Spain in general, not even Christopher Columbus only, but Spain colonized so much of like South America and Middle America. But then the Vikings were the first to actually like make it over to to start trying to colonize like in the Newfoundland area, and then how much of like the Constitution was actually inspired by the Iroquois tribe, which is like a tribe of 6 different Native American groups in the Northeast of the US. There's like so many different things and so much like little nuances and context that was just like, that we just kind of glazed over in primary school, that I'm like, no, actually run that back, because we know that them people didn't come up with nothing on their own. So to find out how many influences are involved in like all of these different battles and all these things we just kind of glazed over in school when we were too young to really understand what any of it really meant, that's like something that's really interesting me right now in my Sagittarius perfection. So the best way to keep me accountable to learning all of that is to share it with you and to tie it to the astrology of today. So welcome to Mixed Mercury University. You are my first students. Very good. Okay, let me see what y'all are saying, and then I'm gonna tap out of this live. People have been trying to warn about Project 2025 for years and were blown off. Yes. Yeah. And if you missed it when I said it earlier, look up Mandates for Leadership by the Heritage Foundation, and that will tell you everything you need to know. 1, about Reagan's administration, because that was the first time they actually implemented it. And then 2, about Trump's first term. And then also what Project 2025 is kind of based on. Trump and Reagan were the only 2 presidents to really like enact at least 2/3 of their policies from the Heritage Foundation. So there's also one you can look into if you like podcasts. Something else I learned some of this from was the 5-4 podcast. And you can find them on Spotify or wherever you have podcasts. They talked about the Federalist Society, so you can watch those episodes. I haven't finished those yet, but those talk about like conservatives packing the Supreme Court and conservatives influencing or wanting to have more influence over the legal system in general and the history of that. What else? Oh, I referenced the YouTube channel that does a lot of some of these more recent history deep dives, Ryan Chapman. And then, yeah, I think that's it so far. If you need any help on that research, let me know. If you need a recruit, I will. At the end, but I do enjoy a lecture. Yes. Thank you for coming with me on this journey. Learning about pre-Nazi Germany has also been enlightening. Yes. Yes, that as well. Yeah, I learned a little bit about pre-Nazi Germany and a little bit about, mostly what I learned about pre-Nazi Germany so far was, or rather like as Nazism was becoming a thing, was kind of the lead into World War II, which was super interesting, gave a lot of insight into Hitler himself as well. It's going to take you into German history. I was in college in the 80s and things were a shit show. Netanyahu started his bullshit in the 80s too. Interesting. I was reading up on the French Revolution, and nationalism wasn't a thing until this time period, and it spread quickly through Europe. Interesting. We'll chat because I've seen more than a few videos that discuss those subjects. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes, it was shared with the Reagan admin first. Yeah, and I really don't know much about the Reagan admin other than Reaganomics, so I need to actually understand what was going on during that time. And yes, Steve Bannon and Roger Stone have been scuttling around forever. Brett Kavanaugh as well. Yep. So, okay, cool. Y'all know things too. This will be fun. And of course, I'm always studying through the lens of astrology, because otherwise I can't say that I find it that interesting without it. But, well, I won't say that. I do find it interesting, but it's the ways that certain events in history are connected through astrology is what's interesting to me versus just history for the sake of history. But that adds that extra layer of context of what was actually happening for these people and like the collective consciousness, and why some of these things worked during the time periods that they did versus time periods where maybe they didn't. So the patterns are very fascinating. Okay. Well, I'm going to go get dressed for work. I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Thank you again so much for joining me. I will see y'all next week to discuss whatever we're discussing. And if I can get an extra live in before then, I will. But I think this week is actually pretty busy, so maybe I won't. But if I can get 2 lives in next week, I will try to do that. So thank you so much. I will see y'all later. Cue outro music.